I do suggest that you review the highlights as you're reviewing the PowerPoints and write the highlights down to help you with memorization, okay?
It's really hard to hear you.
Is it? Okay, let me see. I don't know if this thing is working or not. Oh, I don't know what that is. Hold on. What is going on here? I have no idea what's playing. All right. So supergiantable calculus deposits are just that. They are located. These deposits are located. There we go. Can you guys still hear me?
How's that? Is that better? Yes, okay. Thank you for letting me know. All right, get back to my announcements here. Okay, so if you didn't hear me, tonight worksheets 22, 23, 24, or excuse me, tonight worksheets 24, 25, and 33 are due by 11:59, okay? Then next week we have Unit 5 exam. There's about 21 questions. They are all multiple choice, so multiple choice or true and false. And covering chapters 22, 23, 24, 25, and 33. Okay. So I'm going to open up a whiteboard here, and I'm going to have you guys write down what you remember from chapters 22 and 23. Okay. So here's our whiteboard. So you can just click on that and start writing down what you remember from last week. Here we go. Okay. You guys remember how to do this? I think that's supposed to say eruption stages. Great gubernacular canals. How about what the dental sac forms? Ooh, buccal mucosa, most prone to trauma. Very good. Successional lamina. Okay. Form small openings called gubernacular. Spatial movement, and I know what you're going to say. Sounds like you guys got a lot of what I wanted you to get. This is great. And the centric movement. Very good. So it starts with development of the root. Very good. Okay. Pink is healthy tissue. Red is diseased tissue. Very good. Tooth itself does not play a big role in eruption. Very true. Yep. Okay, just give you guys a couple more seconds here. Okay, so I'm going to leave this up. And what I want you guys, we're just going to go through a few things. So what does the, Brittany, I'll start with you. What does the dental sac form? Can you guys hear me still? Yeah, okay. Can somebody help her out? What does the dental sac form?
It forms the gubernacle canal, or no, the gubernacle cord, which forms the gubernacle canal, right?
Nope, you're thinking of one structure that does that, but it's not the dental sac.
The cementum, alveolar bone, and PDL.
Very good. Okay, so we're gonna go. See here. Let me start a new page. Okay, so it forms the dental sac, forms the attachment apparatus. I think I spelled that wrong. Okay, which includes the cementum. What else does it include?
The PDL.
PDL, the periodontal ligament,
And the
and
alveolar bone.
the alveolar bone. Okay. All right. So the dental sac forms the attachment apparatus. Okay. So why is that important to know when we talk about eruption? Or tooth movement in general?
The PDL plays a role in eruption.
Very good, very good. It's those end and movement. It's those vascular pressures, right?
Mm-hmm.
That are being applied, that are creating the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts. All right. Somebody had put down the difference, or the spatial movement and eccentric movement. Can you guys differentiate the two for me? Go for it, Stephanie. I saw her. She was just about to press her space bar. Oh, we can't hear you, Stephanie.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
The spatial movement, it pushes the crown to the surface, and the eccentric, it's the off-center growth.
Very good, very good. All right. What are our gubernacular canals and where are they located? Let's go with Lindsay. Anybody help her out there?
They're lingual to their primary teeth.
They're what?
Lingual to their primary teeth.
They are lingual, and it's the successional lamina That's what you were thinking of earlier, Neil, is the successional lamina that develops just lingual to those primary teeth, and it creates that gubernacular canal. And then what is the significance of that gubernacular canal?
The guide for the permanent teeth.
It is a guide. That's a great way of putting it. It's a guide for the permanent teeth. Okay. All right, just gotta take a snapshot because I had more people sign in than what stayed. All right. Okay. So when we think of the successional lamina, it is going to be found lingual on the anterior primary teeth. And where are we going to find it with the molars?
Below them.
Below it. Yep, it's going to come up between those roots, right? All right. And somebody actually already put this one, but what is the difference between healthy and unhealthy gingiva? Somebody put a little bit of this answer already on the form.
Healthy is pink,
Um,
healthy is red.
Very good.
Sorry.
So healthy is pink, diseased is reddish. We also might see some inflammation, some loss of stippling in the unhealthy gingiva, okay? Okay, so moving, I put a bunch of questions down on here. Moving from the crown of the tooth to the vestibule, let's name these structures. So what is right around the tooth? So first it's going to be the gingival structures. What are we going to see first?
Free gingiva.
The free gingiva. Okay, what are we going to see next?
The free gingival groove.
Very good. Then what?
Attached
gingiva.
gingiva.
Okay. Then what are we going to find?
The mucogingival.
Mucogingival junction, right?
Yep.
And then last but not least, we're going to have the
Alveolar mucosa.
alveolar mucosa. Okay, so that's the order from the crown to the junctional epithelium. So you have to be able to visualize this, right? So when you say what would be the structure or structures next to the alveolar mucosa, the gingival structure, what would you say?
Mucobuccal or mucolabial fold.
Nope. So next, we're using only these 5. Okay.
So it'll be the mucogingival junction.
The mucogingival junction, right? If that's not an option, then we would go to the attached gingiva. Okay. So your boards might ask something like this: what is next to the mucogingival junction? What 2 structures does it connect? The attached gingiva and the alveolar mucosa. Okay. What about the free gingival groove? It attaches the free gingiva. It's the transition of the free gingiva to the attached gingiva. Okay, does that make sense to you guys? Okay, great. All right, and somebody already put this and I was so impressed. What mucosa is most likely to become keratinized from trauma? Especially like during clenching and grinding.
The buccal mucosa.
The buccal mucosa. Very good. And what do we call that line?
Linea alba.
Very good. The linea alba. Okay. Let's see here. We talked a little bit, just briefly, about sleep apnea last week. Do you guys remember what one of the causes of sleep apnea is?
Enlarged soft palate,
The soft palate. What about the soft palate?
that it's enlarged.
Yeah, there's excess connective tissue, right? So that causes the person to snore, which can cause them to stop breathing. With sleep apnea, they stop breathing for more than 20 seconds several times per hour. Okay, so it's something that definitely can disturb or disrupt somebody's life, right? All right. And can somebody describe what passive eruption is?
The apical movement of the attachment epithelium.
Okay. So what is happening during this time? When does this happen? So it happens throughout one's life, right? And so when we consider somebody who clenches or grinds quite a bit, and there's a lot of attrition, that tooth continues to erupt. Now, sometimes it can't keep up with the wear of the teeth, and you'll get a collapse, but they continue to erupt throughout somebody's life, right? And if they continue to erupt as that attrition is happening, what stage is considered our pathologic stage, our stage where there's recession?
Stage 4.
Stage 4. Very good,
yeah.
Samantha. Thank you. All right, very good, you guys. I feel like you guys have a pretty good handle on the information from last week. Let's move on here with this week's PowerPoint. So we're going to wrap up chapter 24, and then we'll take a little bit of a break, okay? All right, let me close this down. There we go. So we're going to talk about the tongue today. What do you guys already know about the tongue? You guys are so quiet. You look tired today too. It's just been so hot and exhausting, hasn't it? What do we know about the tongue already?
Taste
Different.
buds.
Oh, you go.
Go ahead, Neil.
I was going to say different areas or parts of the tongue sense different tastes.
Yeah, very good. Okay. Samantha, what were you going to say?
I was going to say that the dorsum of the tongue is covered in specialized mucosa.
Very good. What do we know, like what can go wrong with the development of the tongue?
It can become ankylosed.
Ankylosed. Okay, so that's one thing that can happen. What does that mean? What's the common term? What are tongue-tied? Yep. Okay, and that's where the lingual frenum is connected to the tip of the tongue, and they can't move it as readily. All right. What else do we know about the tongue?
Thrush can cultivate on the surface.
Yes, very good. Thrush can be on the surface of the tongue and the buccal mucosa. Thank you, Neil.
Isn't it like the strongest muscle in the body?
It is the strongest muscle in the body, yes. So try retracting that baby. When somebody's got a tough tongue, it can be very difficult to retract. All right, so let's get started with the tongue here. All right, oh, am I sharing? It doesn't look like I'm sharing. All right, so Brittany, I'm gonna have you go ahead and read 1 and 2.
To describe the formation of the tongue as it relates to the germ layers and the pharyngeal arches of the origin, and then to discuss the difference between the extrinsic and intrinsic muscles of the tongue.
Okay, Gao, can you read the next 2?
To describe briefly how tongue movement is accomplished, to describe the papillae of the tongue and their function.
Okay, very good. Let's keep moving here. All right. So development of the tongue, the sac of epithelium is a sac of epithelium within muscles, starts to develop as swellings at the back of the pharyngeal arches. And once those arches kind of burst, it breaks through there. Okay, and that's important for you guys to know. The anterior 2/3 of the tongue develop from the first pharyngeal arch, and the posterior 1/3 or the root of the tongue develops from the copula and the 3rd arch. And I have a great video here in a little bit of a guy that explains it really well. The root and epiglottis develop from the 4th arch. The epithelium develops from the ectoderm and the endoderm. And I know in your book it does say entoderm. Ento and endo are kind of interchangeable sometimes. Endo is more common. And the muscles develop from the mesoderm. So when we talk about tongue muscles, they are skeletal or voluntary striated muscles. We have muscles within the tongue that start and end all within the tongue, okay? There's no fixed or movable end, and the function depends on where it's stabilized. Then we have our extrinsic or muscles outside the tongue that help with movement, and they're gonna originate outside of the tongue, and they're named for the origin and insertion. So when you see genioglossus, glossus is tongue. So genio is the little tubercles right under, these are the incisors, and there's little bony protrusions right here that this muscle attaches to. So it's the genio tubercles here, glossus, meaning it starts here, ends here, okay? So you notice how all of these are glossus and then glossus, because that's where, that's the tongue part, okay? So when we see hyo, what do you guys think? Where do you think that would be attached?
Hyoid bone.
Very good. And the stylo?
Styloid process.
Perfect. Paladoglossus? Where's that going?
Palate.
Yeah. Okay, so keeps it pretty simple, right? All right, so tongue muscles, intrinsic muscles. We have our superior longitudinal group, and this runs from the anterior to the posterior of your tongue, and it's a little closer to the dorsum. It moves superior surface anterior or posteriorly, depending on which is more stabilized. Then we have our inferior longitudinal group, and that's going to run anterior posterior because it's still longitudinal. But of course, this is going to now lie, because it's inferior, it's going to be closer to the ventrum of the tongue, the ventral surface. Okay? Then we have our transverse group. And what does transverse mean to you guys? We've talked about transverse fibers before. What does that mean?
It runs across.
Runs across. We have our transverse ridge. We like this word in dentistry, right? Okay. So it's going to run side to side. And this is going to be what narrows your tongue. What do you think the longitudinal is going to do?
Elongate the tongue?
Long or shorten. Yep, it's going to lengthen it or shorten it. Okay. Then we have our vertical group, and these are going to run from the dorsum to the ventral surfaces. And this is going to flatten the tongue in areas when the muscle is stimulated. Okay. Then we have, again, our extrinsic muscles. Origin is the immovable attachment, and the insertion is the movable attachment. So it's going to insert in the tongue because that's what we want to move. So it moves the insertion towards the origin. So we have 4 pairs. We have our hyoglossus, our styloglossus, palatoglossus, and genioglossus. So our hyoglossus runs from lateral side of the hyoid bone to the lateral borders of the tongue. This pulls the sides of the tongue down into the floor of the mouth. Our styloglossus runs from the styloid process down and forward into the borders of the tongue. So this is going to mesh with the hyoglossus, and this is going to pull the tongue backwards and slightly upwards because that's where the styloid process is, right? So we're going to go up and back. Is that clear to you guys? See how these are moving? This is what's great about these muscles is it kind of tells you what it's doing. All right, we have our palatoglossus, and of course, what do you guys think this is going to do? It's right here. It's going to elevate the posterior part of the tongue and pulls it slightly backwards. So this muscle runs from the anterior soft palate down and forward into the lateral borders of the tongue. Then we have our genioglossus, and this originates from the superior genial tubercles, which are right on the inside down here, and inserts into the midline of the tongue from the tip to the base. This aids in protrusion, retrusion, and depression of the tongue. All right, let's take a little bit of a pause here. And we are going to go to a video here. All this talk of tongue, my tongue's getting dry just thinking about all of this. All right, so here we go. Oh. I love Ken Hub. They have some videos on YouTube, not all, but if you guys ever want to look, go ahead. That's a good resource, okay? So let me share this and let me make sure that it is sharing the audio. There we go. Okay.
Anatomy tutorial where this time we're going to be talking about the structure of the tongue. Yeah. And to do so, we're going to be looking at this image that you see now on the screen, which is basically an image of the superior view of the tongue, also known as the dorsum of the tongue. And let's start.
Hello everyone, this is Megan from KenHub, and welcome to our tutorial on the muscles of the tongue. In today's tutorial, we'll have a look at the anatomy of these muscles, including their actions, their vascular supply, and their innervation. So here we can see an anterior coronal view of the tongue. To give some context, we can see the hard palate here and the hyoid bone here. Now the tongue consists of two groups of muscles. We have the intrinsic muscles and the extrinsic muscles. The intrinsic muscles consist of the superior longitudinal muscle, the vertical muscle, the transverse muscle, and the inferior longitudinal muscle. We then have the extrinsic muscles, which consist of genioglossus, hyoglossus, styloglossus, and platoglossus. After we've discussed these muscles, we will be looking into some clinical notes relating to them. But before we do that, let me give you a bit of an introduction to the tongue and its muscles. The tongue is a muscular organ that helps form the floor of the oral cavity. It has three main functions: deglutition or swallowing, gustation or taste, and phonation or speech. It consists of a root, which is the posterior third of the tongue, and a body, which is the anterior 2/3. The dorsum of the tongue is divided into two halves by the median sulcus, which is located on the body of the tongue here. So in the next image, we can see the coronal view of the tongue and its muscles. Highlighted here is the lingual mucosa, which is usually pink and moist. This is a part of the tongue that covers the dorsum of the tongue and contains papillae and nerve endings for the sense of taste. For more on the lingual papillae and how they perceive taste, please take a look on our website for a video on the lingual papillae. So in the next image, we can see all of the tongue highlighted in green. It is separated into left and right halves by the vertical lingual septum, which underlies the median sulcus and continues down to attach to the hyoid bone. The tongue consists of 8 pairs of muscles, which are located bilaterally on either side of the lingual septum. 4 of these muscles are intrinsic muscles, which are located within the tongue itself and are highlighted here in this image. The other 4 muscles are located outside the tongue and are referred to as extrinsic muscles. The intrinsic muscles act to change the shape of the tongue, whereas the extrinsic muscles are involved in the movement of the tongue. So let's start off by looking at the extrinsic muscles of the tongue. The first extrinsic muscle we'll look at is the genioglossus muscle. This muscle originates from the mental spines of the mandible and inserts at the bottom of the tongue and the hyoid bone. The main actions of the genioglossus is to protrude or stick out the tongue. It also acts to depress the tongue. It is supplied by the sublingual branch of the lingual artery as well as the submental branch of the facial artery. Both the lingual and facial arteries are branches of the external carotid artery. The genioglossus is innervated by the hypoglossal nerve, which is the 12th cranial nerve. If we switch to a lateral view, you can see that the genioglossus is triangular in shape and arises from the mental spines of the mandible. The next extrinsic muscle we will look at is the hyoglossus. The hyoglossus is a thin muscle that extends from the side of the tongue to the hyoid bone. The main action of this muscle is to depress the tongue. Like the genioglossus, it's supplied by the sublingual branch of the lingual artery as well as the submental branch of the facial artery. It is also innervated by the hypoglossal nerve. A great way to remember this muscle is by breaking down its name. So hyo refers to its relationship with the hyoid bone, and glossus relates to the fact that it's a muscle of the tongue. So if we switch to a lateral view, we can see that it inserts into the side of the tongue, between the inferior longitudinal muscle and the styloglossus muscle. The next muscle we'll look at is the styloglossus, which is another extrinsic muscle of the tongue. The styloglossus inserts into each side of the tongue and extends around each side laterally to meet the styloid process of the skull. The main action of the styloglossus is to draw the tongue upwards, but it also acts to retract the tongue backwards in the mouth. It's supplied by the sublingual branch of the lingual artery and is innervated by the hypoglossal nerve. Again, you can remember the name of this muscle due to its relationship with the styloid process. If we look at the lateral view of this muscle, we can see its attachment with the styloid process of the temporal bone. As it travels from this process towards the tongue, it divides into two parts, a longitudinal part, which blends with the inferior longitudinal muscle, and an oblique part, which overlaps with the hyoglossus. The fourth and final extrinsic muscle of the tongue is called the palatoglossus muscle. It is also considered to be a muscle of the soft palate. In this image, we can see the palatoglossus muscle originating from the soft palate and continuing downwards to insert into the side of the tongue. The palatoglossus elevates the root of the tongue and closes off the oral cavity from the oral pharynx. It is supplied by the ascending pharyngeal artery, which is a branch of the external carotid artery. It's also supplied by the ascending palatine branch of the facial artery. The palatoglossus is the only muscle of the tongue that is not innervated by the hypoglossal nerve. Instead, it is innervated by the pharyngeal plexus. The pharyngeal plexus is derived from cranial nerves 9, 10, and the cranial part of 11. Like styloglossus and hyoglossus, the name of this muscle can also be remembered due to its relationship with the soft palate. From a lateral view, we can see that the palatoglossus arises from the soft palate and then passes anteriorly, laterally, and inferiorly to insert onto the side of the tongue. So now let's move on to the intrinsic muscles of the tongue. The first intrinsic muscle we'll look at is the superior longitudinal muscle. Individually, the superior longitudinal muscle turns the end and sides of the tongue upwards to make it concave. With the inferior longitudinal muscle, it acts to shorten the tongue. As we can see in this image, the superior longitudinal muscle is located beneath the lingual mucosa and extends from the lingual septum to the edge of the tongue on either side. If we look at this muscle from a lateral view, we can see that the superior longitudinal muscle extends backwards and is always located deep to the lingual mucosa. The next intrinsic muscle we will look at is the inferior longitudinal muscle. The inferior longitudinal muscle is located below the inferior lingual surface. Acting alone, the inferior longitudinal muscle brings the ends of the tongue down, making the tongue a convex shape. As stated previously, when it works with the superior longitudinal muscle, it acts to shorten the tongue. From the lateral view, we can see that the inferior longitudinal muscle extends from the root of the tongue to the front, where it blends with the styloglossus muscle. Now let's look at the next intrinsic muscle of the tongue, the vertical muscle of the tongue. This muscle extends from the dorsal side of the tongue to the ventral side. The vertical muscle acts to flatten and widen the tongue. The final intrinsic muscle we'll look at is the transverse muscle of the tongue. This muscle passes laterally from the lingual septum on either side. The function of this muscle is to narrow and elongate the tongue. All of the intrinsic muscles of the tongue are supplied by the lingual artery, and they are innervated by the hypoglossal nerve, which is the 12th cranial nerve. So in summary, there are 8 pairs of muscles of the tongue located on either side of the median lingual sulcus. 4 of these muscles are extrinsic muscles which act to move the tongue. They are the genioglossus, the hyoglossus, the styloglossus, and the palatoglossus. In addition, there are 4 intrinsic muscles which act to change the shape of the tongue. These are the superior longitudinal muscle, the inferior longitudinal muscle, the vertical muscle, and the transverse muscle. To finish off this tutorial, we'll go over some clinical notes related to the tongue. As 7 out of 8 of the muscles of the tongue are supplied by the hypoglossal nerve, damage to one of these nerves can cause weakening of the muscles on the same side of the lesion. It can also cause unilateral paralysis, which is shown clinically as the tongue deviating to the same side of the lesion when the tongue is protruded. Damage to the hypoglossal nerve can be caused by strokes, multiple sclerosis, or brainstem tumours. So that concludes our tutorial on the muscles of the tongue. I hope you enjoyed it and thank you for listening.
Okay, How was that, you guys? Did that help clarify where they're located and see what their purpose is?
Do we have access to that website?
No, this is my personal subscription to it. So, but like I said, there are many of these videos on YouTube. Okay. All right. Let's see here. There we go. All right, let's move back to our PowerPoint here. All right. All right, so now we're going to move to the different structures on the tongue. So you guys know, you guys are already familiar with that we have papilla on our tongue, right? Small little elevations. Okay, so our papilla are stratified squamous epithelium, and they cover the tongue. The ventral surface, remember that's the underside, that's really thin epithelium. Okay, so if you were to nick that, you would see the inside, the connective tissue immediately after. Or on the dorsum, or the dorsal surface of the tongue, you're going to see thick parakeratinized to keratinized epithelium. So papilla are the elevated structures that are scattered throughout the dorsum. There are several different kinds of papilla. All right, so we have 4 types. We have our circumvallate or our valley papilla. And I always think those are easy to remember because they're valley papilla and they make a V here. It's just this single line right here of papilla. Okay. I also think fungiform are easy to remember because what's a common fungus? A mushroom, right? And they're kind of mushroom shaped. You can't really see it on here, but they're a little bit bigger than the smaller filiform papilla. All right, so then our filiform are filling in all the rest of the tongue, the dorsum of the tongue. Then we have our foliate, and those are on the side of the tongue, and you're going to see that as we move more posterior, it becomes more striated. All right, so our circumvallate papilla is a V-shaped row. They're circular rays. There's usually about 13 of them, and in some people, they're really evident. Okay, they kind of separate the anterior 2/3 of the tongue from the posterior third of the tongue. The point of the V faces posteriorly, marks an area that develops from different pharyngeal arches. The rest are in the trough. So here's our troughs, and that's where our taste buds are found. So these are surrounded by taste buds around the lateral surfaces and salivary glands at the bottom of the trough. Okay, so here's our taste buds and then our salivary glands. Those would be minor salivary glands. Now, one thing that's important to know about this is that everybody write this down, these papilla are what serves to wash and clean the tongue. Okay? And that's what makes them kind of ready for new tastes. And the glands that do secrete there that are helping wash are called, and everybody write this down, the glands of von Ebner. Okay. Let's move on to our fungiform papilla. And again, these are tiny rays. They appear redder in younger people. They do have taste buds on the dorsal surface of the papilla. All right, so our fungiform are right here. And again, they kind of look like a mushroom. are filiform, the covering of the remainder of the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. They are pointed, keratinized, parakeratinized to keratinized. The filiform, although they're all over the tongue, actually have no function in tasting. So you think that your whole tongue is tasting it? It's not. It's generally that circumvallae or the vallae papilla and the fungiform papilla. So what the filiform do is that's what's going to help you feel things. It's a sensory to feel, you know, is something sharp, is something hot, well, not necessarily hot, but the texture of your food, okay? So if we go back to this picture, you can see they are just pointed little papilla, the filiform. Then we have our foliate, and this is the roughened lateral surfaces of the tongue. On the human tongue, they contain fewer taste buds compared with other animals. The foliate papilla, again, you would have to kind of, during the intra and extraoral exam, you're going to have to pull the tongue out and view those. Because remember, the lateral borders of the tongue are going to be your most common spots for oral cancer. All right. This is our last slide here. Changes that may indicate health problems. Glossitis. Glossitis is where the epithelia of the papilla are lost and the tongue becomes very smooth. That can be really uncomfortable for the patient. Then we have hairy tongue. And hairy tongue, I want you guys actually to know all of these terms here, but hairy tongue is where the papilla are really long. Has anybody ever heard of hairy tongue before? Yeah, and it sounds really gross, right? So it's just these elongated papilla that can also get stained by food and bacteria. Now, I just saw an article on COVID, and some people they think are getting hairy tongue and discolored tongue from all of the PPE and the masks and the oral rinses that we're using. So kind of interesting. Might be seeing more of that in the near future. Posterior lateral borders can become red and irritated. This is an area of oral cancer. It's important clinical indicator to find these problems and know where the lingual tonsils are and where oral cancer is mostly found. Now, one huge indicator of an individual's health is their tonsils, right? Because it is lymphoid tissue. And what do you think if those are red and diseased? We see that with strep, right? Has anyone here had strep? Or let me put it this way, has anybody not had strep here, right? And where do they look? They look in your tonsils because that's where infection can be found because it is that lymphatic tissue, okay? Any questions? Okay, let's watch one more video here. Now, somebody did ask about the availability of these resources. This video will be on this recording of the lecture, so you guys can always go back and view that, okay? All right.
Everyone, from Ken Hubban. Welcome to another anatomy tutorial
For this time, we're going to be talking about the structure of the tongue. And to do so, we're going to be looking at this image that you see now on the screen, which is basically an image of the superior view of the tongue, also known as the dorsum of the tongue. And let's start with the very first highlight that you now see, the first green highlight, which is the body of the tongue. The body of the tongue is bordered anteriorly by the tip, also known as the apex, and posteriorly by this structure here, which is known as the root of the tongue. The body makes up the anterior 2/3 of the entire tongue. And there is also this structure here, this depression, which is known as the median sulcus, which runs along the middle of the body of the tongue vertically. The mucosa of the body of the tongue is covered in a lot of structures known as the lingual papillae, plural for papilla. Now, the list includes filiform papillae, the fungiform papillae, the valate papillae, and also foliate papillae. Now, these structures, these papillae, contain taste buds with the exception of the filiform papillae. We're going to move on to another highlight here of a structure that I just mentioned before. This is known as the median sulcus. The median sulcus of the tongue is a groove that runs from the apex of the tongue to just in front of the beginning of the root of the tongue. This sulcus will be dividing the body of the tongue into a left and right side. Next highlight, which I also mentioned before, this is known as the apex of the tongue, a fancy word to just meaning or describing the anteriormost portion of the tongue, or in other words, the tip of your tongue. The next structure that we're going to be highlighting is known as, also one that I talked about, the root of the tongue, which is the posteriormost portion of the tongue. This structure will be then anchoring the tongue to the mandible and the hyoid bone. The root makes up 1/3 of the tongue and contains the lingual tonsils, and it is separated from the body of the tongue by a V-shaped terminal sulcus, which you see a little bit here on this image. This is the terminal sulcus, which we also will be highlighting on the next slide. So this is the terminal sulcus, which is a V-shaped groove that separates two structures, the root, and also this one here that we talked about before, the body of the tongue. Now, as you can see here, the valate papillae, they run parallel to the terminal sulcus. So these dots that you see here represented on this illustration. The next area that we're going to be highlighting here on this image, this is where we find the foliate papillae. They are located on the posterolateral end of the body of the tongue. They contain several taste buds. Next, we're going to be highlighting these dots that I just mentioned before. These are the valate papillae. They're also known as circumvallate papillae and are located in the front of the foramen cecum, which is this structure here, this little dot that you see, which is found near the root of the tongue. The valate papillae, they run parallel to the terminal sulcus, as I mentioned before, and are covered by stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium. Something important that you should have on your notes is that these structures are innervated by the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is a cranial nerve. To be more specific, it is the cranial nerve number 9. As you can see here, and as I mentioned, the valate papillae, they are innervated by the glossopharyngeal nerve, and like the rest of the body of the tongue that gets a sensory innervation from the chorda tympani, which is a branch of the facial nerve, and also the lingual nerve. The next structure, which we also talked about before, this dot here represents the foramen cecum of the tongue. The foramen cecum is located at the midline just anterior to the terminal sulcus on the body of the tongue. Now, this structure is an embryological remnant of the thyroglossal duct and is formed during the descent of the thyroid gland during embryological development. Next structures highlighted here, these are known as the lingual tonsils. Now, the lingual tonsils are comprised of lymphatic tissue and cover the root of the tongue, as you can see. Now, this mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, also known as MALT, M-A-L-T, is covered by stratified squamous epithelium. The lingual tonsils contain lingual follicles. The next structures that we're going to be highlighting here, also tonsils, this time known as the palatine tonsils, that are comprised of lymphatic tissue and are located between
Miss Entinger, we can't hear you.
Thank you. The palatine tonsils, when you go in for your strep test, that's what they're swiping. Okay. So what you'll see here, there's a couple arches here, and I believe they go into the arches on this video. And they lie right in between there. So when you're looking in somebody's mouth, you're going to look for this lymphatic tissue. This is a common area for HPV cancers. Okay. So we want to make sure that we are familiar with their location. All right.
the palatoglossal and palatopharyngeal arches of the oral cavity. They contain tonsillar crypts and epithelial invaginations called the tonsillar pits. On the next slide, I'm going to be highlighting the epiglottis, as you can see here. It's comprised of elastic cartilage. The epiglottis is covered with mucous membrane and is located behind the tongue, as you can see clearly on this image. The epiglottis is attached to the larynx and acts as a flap covering the larynx during swallowing to prevent then food from entering the respiratory tract. The mucosa of the epiglottis also contains what's known as taste buds. The next highlight that you see here is known as the epiglottic vallecula, which are depressions located between the median and lateral glossoepiglottic folds. And as you can see here in the image, they're located just behind the root of the tongue. Next structure that we're going to be highlighting here is known as the median glossoepiglottic fold. And the median glossoepiglottic fold is formed by the mucous membrane and is located along the median plane between the epiglottis and the base of the tongue. On the sides, we're going to be finding these folds here, which are known as the lateral glossoepiglottic folds. And in the same way as the median glossoepiglottic fold, they are formed by mucous membrane. They are partially attached to the pharyngeal wall and are located between the base of the tongue and also the epiglottis. Next on our list, we're going to be highlighting these arches here, which are known as the palatopharyngeal arches. Now, the palatopharyngeal arches are found on either side of the oral cavity near the root of the tongue at the opening of the oral cavity to then the pharynx. So a bit of location here, you can see here, this is the oral cavity. Just behind, you're going to be finding the next structure, which is then the pharynx. Now, these arches are covered by mucous membrane and are formed by projections of some muscles, the palatopharyngeal muscles, which will be extending between the palate and the pharyngeal wall as well. And here on this image, we only see the bottom part of these arches. Now that you just completed this video tutorial, that it's time for you to continue your learning experience by testing and also applying your knowledge.
All right. Again, this will be on our video for today, so you guys can always go back and watch it if you feel like that's helpful, okay? All right, that wraps up our section on the tongue. Let's take a 15-minute break and come back, okay? Everybody go get some coffee. All right, everybody, if you want to come back so we can start our PowerPoint on the salivary glands. Okay, got a few more. Okay, and I do need to see faces for attendance. So we have Samantha, Kenza, Taylor, Jessica. Neil, Stephanie, Kate, Brittany, Summer, Sarah, Ashley, Chelsea, Haley, Madison, and Esther. Okay. Danielle, Danielle on here. Doesn't look like it. Okay. Okay. Well, let's move on to salivary glands. And I'm going to put up this whiteboard again. And I want you guys to just share what you know about salivary glands. There we go. Go ahead and share what you know about salivary glands. Oh, very good. Ooh, very good. Okay, so this is looking really good. So it looks like we have quite a bit of information here. Let me pull you guys up here. from the autonomic saliva. Okay. Okay, so it looks like you guys already have a really good idea of what I would hope you guys would know at this point, and even a little bit more. So, okay, 99% water, very good. All right. Well, let's go into our lecture portion, and maybe we'll revisit this at the end because this is really good. Okay, stop share. There we go. All right, so let's get into our PowerPoint. Does anybody know the names of the salivary glands that we'll be discussing today?
The parotid, the submandibular, and the sublingual glands.
Very good. And then the minor salivary glands. Very good. Okay. So this is chapter 25. Okay. This up here. There we go. All right. So by the end of this chapter, the student should be able to describe the components of a salivary gland, to describe the duct system of a salivary gland, describe the arrangement of cells of a mixed salivary gland, to describe how saliva is formed and modified before secretion, and to describe the functions of saliva. All right, so components of salivary glands. Oh, gotta let a couple people in, I think, here. Oh, chat. Oh, thank you for redoing attendance for me, you guys. You guys are amazing. All right. Oh, I went back. I didn't mean to. Okay, so they do ride from a cord of epithelium, and that grows and later forms a tube. And the tube then has a cluster of cells that secrete different products, okay? And that is the acini, okay? And the end of clusters are either going to be rounded or tube-like. So components of a salivary gland, acini, the secretory end pieces, the proteins, and there are three kinds of acinar cells. There's serous, mucus, and seromucus. All right, so their seromucus is just a combination of the two. All right. The outer edge or base rests on the basement membrane of this is of the acini. It does rest up against the connective tissue. The myoepithelial cells surround each of the secretory acinus, and they can contract just like a muscle. All right. That merocrine secretion is the myoepithelial cell squeezes that acinus and moves the saliva out through the duct system. So what do you think might trigger that? Now, some of you guys said that it is controlled by the parasympathetic system, and that is correct. So what do you think could possibly trigger some of this merocrine secretion to activate? Think of what's happening. It's squeezing the cell and pushing the saliva out. So what could activate that?
The nervous system?
The nervous system, but what would activate that autonomic so we can't tell our mouth to salivate? So what is going to activate it?
A stimulus like food or like...
Yes, any stimuli like that. So food, smells, stuff like that. You guys ever smell a food that you really, really enjoy, and all of a sudden you start to salivate, or just even thinking of a food that you would enjoy, or you think, oh, I could really go for this right now. It's activating the automatic system to secrete the saliva. So our serous acini is going to be a lot thinner and more watery than from others, okay? The primary source, this is the primary source of amylase. And why do you guys think amylase, do you guys know what amylase is? Should know this from anatomy.
Does it break down food?
Yes, it breaks down our carbohydrates. Yep. So it's the primary source of amylase. So this is very important, right? This is the beginning of our digestion. They are pyramidal in shape, and the lumen is very small, lumen meaning opening, right? The adjacent cell membranes are very difficult to see. They don't stain very well usually. I'm trying to think. Actually, I think it's the mucus that don't stain very well. The nucleus is round and close to the base of the cells. All right, so now that was serous. Now we're going to mucus. And the secretion is slightly viscous. What does viscous mean to you guys?
Kind of like thicker.
Thicker. Very good. Okay, it is 99% water. It has inorganic ions such as sodium, potassium, chloride, fluoride would also be part of this. And this has very little amylase in it. It is more tubular, and it's a much larger lumen, and I'll show you guys on a video. You'll see that the lumen is much bigger than that of the serous acinus. The nucleus is usually very flat and lies against the basal or the bottom end of the cell. And the apical end appears frothy when magnified. And again, I have a nice video for you guys to see that on. Again, these are pyramidal in shape. Now we have our seromucus. And I think the video shows it really well, but you're going to see the mucus cells kind of on the end part of it, and then you're going to see the serous down farther. So on the end of the tube is a group of serous cells that form half-moon cluster, serous demilums. I'm sorry, I think I said that backwards earlier. And they secrete their product between the cell walls of the underlying mucus cells. Secretion then enters the lumen of the gland, which is then squeezed out of there. All right, so components of a salivary gland, connective tissue capsule. It is surrounds, this connective tissue is going to surround this here, okay? And it sends partitions into the gland, and that's where the nerves and the blood vessels are entering into the gland, okay? Now this connective tissue is what makes, I'm trying to get this connective tissue here is what then forms these lobes or lobules, okay? So that's kind of what's dividing up these clusters of tissue. The duct system, varying number of lobules, they really depend on their size. Each is surrounded by connective tissue. There are different kinds. We have some that are in the lobule. So would that be intra or inter?
Intra.
Intra. Okay, if it's within something, it's intra. And then between lobules, it would be interlobular. Outside of the gland and the surrounding connective tissue that leads to the surface of the oral cavity. So this duct system is important for it to drain because these are exocrine glands. Do you guys remember us talking about that? Endocrine and exocrine. Endocrine, an example would be the pituitary gland, right? That's just staying within your body, where the exocrine is excreting out, so our sweat glands and our salivary glands. So our intralobular ducts are within the lobule. There are two types, the intercalated and striated. All right, so our intercalated are very small, directly drain the acini. They may be long or short, easy to see, or they can be difficult. So I always think that's funny. Easy to see or difficult. Carry secretions to the next set of ducts. Then we have our striated, and these cells appear striped. The mitochondria is trapped in the basal cell membrane. Remember, basal is kind of basement, so bottom. Cell membrane changes salivary fluid as it passes through. And then this resorbs water and substances such as sodium, potassium, chloride, and is returned to the capillaries and the lymph tissues. Going to our interlobular ducts, these lie within the connective tissue between the lobes. Okay, so we had intra, now we have inter. There is some striated found at the beginning of the interlobular ducts, but for the most part, they are not striated, okay? And I want everybody to highlight that the interlobular are for the most part not striated. And the intra are mainly striated. Now the difference between the intra and the inter is the intra is what's going to modify our saliva, okay? The inter is just traveling through. It's not modifying our excretions. Oh, that's nice and blurry. Okay, so control of secretions comes from our autonomic nervous system, particularly the parasympathetic, and that's going to be really important when we get into pharmacology and we start talking about medications. Maybe you guys already know, but medications, a lot of medications can cause dry mouth. Does anybody here take allergy medications on a daily basis? Oh, you luckies. Okay, Sarah. She's like, oh, all right, fine, I'll raise my hand. Do you ever experience dry mouth?
I don't think I've noticed anything, no.
Okay, so that is one category of dry mouth drugs that cause dry mouth is the antihistamines, okay? All right, so this is tied to chewing, taste, and smell. Can modify, meaning it's tied to chewing, taste, and smell. So if you're chewing something, it's going to stimulate the secretions. If you're tasting something, it's going to stimulate the secretions and the smell. That's why sometimes people who have hyposalivation, they're still salivating, but maybe not as much. We often will recommend chewing gum, okay? Because the chewing and the taste together, and sometimes the smell, can all help stimulate a little more saliva. So we can modify the amount and consistency of salivary secretions through medications. The formation of saliva, it's formed within the endoplasmic reticulum of individual cells, going way back to our introduction, the cell basics. It is packaged by a membrane within the Golgi apparatus. It moves out into the cytoplasm of the mucus or serous acini, and then at the apical end of the cells, it accumulates these granules of future saliva. Then the parasympathetic nervous system stimulates that gland to move those granules to the apical cell membrane and eventually squeeze them out. So those granules fuse with the apical cell membrane, and then they release substance into their lumen, their hole of the acini. The secretions, and remember, there's many of these acini around there. So this is all happening at once. It's not just one little one creating it. It's all happening at once. The secretion moves into the striated intralobular ducts and the striated interlobular and extrinsic ducts, and then it moves into the oral cavity. As fluid passes through striated ducts, water is pulled out of the lumen and pulled through the striated duct into the capillaries at the base of the duct. So conservation of electrolytes and secretion of potassium and bicarbonate also occurs. Fluid in the duct becomes more concentrated, and the amount of amylase, that is what's breaking down our carbohydrates, varies and begins to break down those starches. Also contains immunoglobulins, antibacterial lysosomes, and is a pH buffer. So when we look at all of that, it's very important that we have saliva, right? Antibacterial, that's a big thing in the mouth, right? What are both caries and periodontal disease? They're both bacterial infections. Okay, so saliva is very important. And then the pH buffer is pH of the tooth is one component to breaking down the enamel. So you have multiple factors right here that can help prevent decay. All right, so what is our function of saliva? It helps prepare the bolus of food for easier swallowing by lubricating it. Helps to keep the mucous membranes lubricated so you don't have xerostomia. Prevents drying out and parakeratinizing and keratinizing mucous membranes. Helps prevent dehydration. Dry mouth stimulus to drink water. Then we have our pH buffer. That's really important in decay. Immunoglobulins and lysosomes that help protect the body. It cleanses the teeth and neutralizes the acids to prevent tooth decay. Your mouth is constantly under attack from all the foods and drinks that we have, and we're going to talk about that in a couple semesters, just about how often your mouth is always under attack. Every time I sip my coffee, it's another assault on my enamel. Okay? So in review, there are three major salivary glands. If you guys recall from your anatomy course, right? The parotid is going to be our serous or watery secretions. So it's going to be our serous acini. Then we have our submandibular, sometimes referred to as submaxillary. And here we have our seromucous secretions, or mixed secretions. And then the sublingual is going to be mainly mucus. There is a few serous in there, but it is mainly mucus secretions. Then we have a lot of minor salivary glands that mainly secrete mucus. And the minor salivary glands, where do you guys think those are found in the oral cavity? Minor salivary glands, where are those found? It's on the slide.
Labial buccal, palatal, and
Okay. Thank you. It's a rough morning, I know. Mondays, the schedule's cruel. So they're found all over in the mouth. Has anybody ever had what's called a mucocele? No? Okay. So a mucocele is where one of these minor salivary glands gets traumatized and plugged. And it's just a really thin, watery, or saliva-filled little bubble that appears on your labial mucosa. It's usually on the labial mucosa because people chew their lip sometimes. And so you'll find them right down here. My daughter gets them all the time. She's very proud of them. I told her it makes her special, and she believed it. So, but they're just clear. I mean, you can almost see through them. Okay, so that is a minor salivary glands. They're found everywhere except for the anterior hard palate. Basically, that's how I think of it. Is they're found on all of the labial mucosa, the palate, everything, except for the very anterior third of the palate. All right, so depending on their size, salivary glands have varying numbers of lobules. What do you guys think is our largest gland of the three?
the parotid gland.
The parotid, yeah. Even though it only secretes about, 25 to 30% of the saliva, it's this massive gland here, but it only produces a small amount. The submandibular is what's going to produce the most, 60 to 65%. And then the sublingual is roughly 10%. Intralobulated refers to ducts that are located within the tubule. Interlobulated refers to ducts within connective tissue between the lobes and glands, while striated cells occur in both intralobular and interlobular duct system. They are much more common in intralobular ducts. The bases of the cells within striated ducts appear to be striped. Our myoepithelial cells surrounding the acini have long cellular projections. Everybody highlight that. All right. The primary function of the lingual glands of von Ebner, we talked about that. Oh, somebody highlighted it on there. It's weird. How did, oh, you did it on this one, but you'll want to do it on your own, okay? And then the primary function, actually somebody can highlight that on mine too here. The primary function of the lingual glands of von Ebner is to wash off the taste buds so they can perceive new taste. Circle that, highlight that, okay? Although most minor salivary glands are pure mucus cells, a smaller percent are pure serous, and even less are mixed. So the mucus secretions aid in minor salivary glands in the role of keeping the mucosal surfaces nice and moist so that you don't have xerostomia. Okay? All right. Let me stop sharing this for a moment. And then I think this guy is amazing. There we go. All right, make sure my sound is being shared here. Okay. Everybody get their popcorn.
Hey y'all, Brown's back, and this time we're going to be talking about spit. How exciting is that? We're beginning our unit on accessory digestive organs. Those are organs that aren't part of the alimentary canal, but that secrete something into the alimentary canal to assist with the 5 digestive functions, being ingestion, digestion, propulsion, absorption, and defecation. And the salivary glands are going to be important both for chemical and mechanical digestion. Now, your mouth contains dozens of tiny little, what we call minor salivary glands. They're scattered throughout the oral cavity, and they are important, but most of your saliva comes from 3 pairs of what we call the major salivary glands. So we're going to be focusing primarily on the major salivary glands. Saliva is a really complex fluid. I said in the intro to this video, that's in your course module, there are over 1,100 unique proteins in saliva. And it's doing a lot for us, and it's doing that through the secretion of 2 main factors or fluid components. So saliva contains a combination of serous fluid and mucus. Mucus being primarily the glycoprotein mucin, mucin. And these glands are going to secrete either serous fluid, mucus, or some combination thereof. The minor glands that are scattered throughout the oral cavity are largely only mucus-secreting glands. Your major glands are either serous glands or seromucous glands, meaning they're secreting a combination of both serous fluid and mucus. The 3 glands we're going to look at are the parotid gland here, which is located kind of posterior to the mandible in your cheek. The submandibular gland, which as its name implies, is under the mandible. And then finally the sublingual gland, which as its name implies, is under the tongue. We're going to start kind of in the back and make our way forward. So the first one we're going to look at is the parotid gland. The parotid gland is a branched acinar gland, meaning that it has these acini, these kind of ball-shaped secretory portions, and it has multiple of them that share a central duct. So it's a branched acinar gland, and it's primarily serous secretion. You're not going to see a lot of mucus secreting, or any really mucus secreting cells inside the parotid gland. But that serous fluid is going to contain some very important components. One of those being salivary alpha amylase, which is an enzyme that begins the chemical digestion of carbohydrates, like starches. If we look in the micrograph on the right, we can see, and I'm going to have to use a different color. Here we go. Let's go to maybe a nice blue. Over here on the right, the secretory portion is to the right of this blue line I'm drawing. So these cells over here, these are the secretory cells, and they contain numerous secretory granules inside them. So you can see the vesicles there that contain the serous fluid that's going to be excreted and eventually transported into the ducts. So this structure here, that I'm doing a very poor job of outlining, is a duct. You can see the cuboidal epithelial cells that make up the lining of the duct. Here's the contents and the lumen of the duct. And then there's connective tissue out here. This connective tissue is not unimportant. The connective tissue, I couldn't find a picture that showed them really well, but this connective tissue can actually contain B lymphocytes, and those are going to be secreting IgA antibodies, which are the antibody form that we find in exocrine secretions. These glands, having a duct, are exocrine glands, and so it's unsurprising that we would find IgA in there. So the parotid gland, it is a branched acinar gland. It is serous secretion only, and its secretions include things like alpha amylase and immunoglobulin A. Making our way forward, the next gland up is the submandibular gland. This gland actually produces about 2/3 of the saliva that your mouth is going to make. And it is a compound or branched tubuloacinar gland, meaning that it is going to have acini, kind of the little ball-shaped structures here at the end, but these are also going to be connected via tubules that we see here in purple. So it is a tubuloacinar gland, and it is a mixed gland. If we look at our micrograph on the right, and I have a higher mag one coming up, we can find mucus-secreting cells here. These are called mucus tubules. So the part I'm outlining here in blue is the part that would be purple in our diagram over here on the left. And then the serous secreting portions, there's some good examples down here at the bottom, are largely the kind of half-moon shaped areas that we see out here in the acini. So because the acini tend to have kind of a mucousy portion at the part where it connects to this mucus tubule, the acinar portion is shaped in section in the microscope kind of like a half moon. So we refer to these as serous demilunes. And demilunes just means little half moons. So we make little half moons down here. If we look at slightly higher magnification, we can see a mucus tubule. Say your words, Patrick. So this lighter staining stuff, the glycoprotein mucin, which is the primary component of mucus, doesn't stain well in histological preparation. So cells that contain a lot of mucin are going to appear pretty transparent. You can see a cross-section through a mucus tubule here and here. And then you can also see up here at the very top how the serous secreting portion, the part that stains purple, is going to make kind of this half moon. So this is a serous demilune. Okay. And in addition to alpha amylase, the serous secretions of the submandibular gland also contain lysozyme. Lysozyme is an enzyme that's found in exocrine secretions, particularly in saliva and in tears, and it has antibacterial properties. It actually breaks down the cell wall of bacteria, thus helping to prevent infection. And then finally, the last and smallest of our major endocrine glands is the sublingual gland. Like the submandibular gland, it is a branched tubuloacinar gland, so at the macroscopic level, it's going to have a very similar structure. However, as you look at this micrograph, you can see that it's dominated by mucus-secreting cells. So these kind of columnar cells, you can actually see the outlines between them. Right there, you can see the cell membranes. So there is some serous secretion. There is a small amount of alpha amylase and lysozyme produced by the sublingual gland. However, the vast majority of its secretion is mucus. So technically, it is a seromucus gland like the submandibular gland, but practically, it is a seromucus gland. It's pretty much only making mucus. That's really it for the salivary glands. So you have your minor salivary glands secreting mucus, your major salivary glands, the parotid gland, which is a serous gland, the submandibular and sublingual glands, which are seromucus glands, and together this combination of serous fluid and mucus and all of the proteins that come in it are going to help us digest our food, going to help bind our food together into a ball so that we can swallow it, and also going to help us taste, because taste or chemoception, the reception of chemicals, has to be done in an aqueous environment, and it's going to assist with preventing the oral route of infection by containing both antibodies and antibacterial enzymes. Well, that's it for now. Hope you had fun. Study hard. See you later. Hey, y'all. Brown's back, and this time
Okay, did that help clear things up a little? It's nice to have that visual, isn't it? Okay. All right. Let's keep moving on here. Maybe get you guys out a little bit early again today, huh? All right. Move your lovely faces here so I can see them. There we go. Okay. All right, so now we're going to go into, we've just finished our histology and embryology section of our book. I'm sure you guys are all happy to hear that, right? So we're going to go into anatomy, and we're going to jump forward a few chapters since we just talked about salivary glands. I wanted to go right into the salivary glands since it's all fresh in your head, okay? So chapter, you guys see my PowerPoint? Or it's just the, okay. Let me get that up for you. There we go. All right, so this is chapter 33. And by the end of this chapter, students should be able to describe the difference between major and minor salivary glands. You should be able to name and locate each of the major and minor salivary glands. Should be able to classify each of the glands according to its type of secretion, to describe the function of saliva, and to describe the development of the ducts and ductless glands. All right. So I'm not sure who I'm hearing. I just heard a ding go off somewhere. All right. So classification of salivary glands. We have exocrine, merocrine, compound tubulo-alveolar, serous, mixed, or mucus. They're also divided into major and minor salivary glands. So our major salivary glands, we have three pairs of large glands. Produce the bulk of saliva in the mouth. Okay, so we know those are our parotid, our submandibular, and our sublingual, right? Then we have minor salivary glands, and those are found throughout the oral cavity, and they secrete minor amounts of saliva onto the mucus to keep the surface moist. What do our minor salivary glands primarily secrete?
Mucus.
Thank you, Jessica. Very good. All right, our major salivary glands, three paired glands, parotid, submandibular, sublingual. Now these are important because, and their locations are important because when you guys go in to do the intra and extraoral exam, you need to know where each of these is located because you need to check and see, is it nice and soft or is it full and hard, okay? So they do produce the bulk of the saliva in the mouth. Saliva mixes with food, especially that amylase, and it's going to help break down the starches. And when mixed with food, the mucus especially, it kind of coats the food and makes it a little easier to swallow. It also helps keep the mucosa in the oral cavity from drying out, and it aids in swallowing and speech. Major salivary glands are parotid gland. Our parotid gland is located on the surface of the masseter muscle. Can you guys show me where your masseter muscle is? Does anybody know yet? So it's back here. Okay. So it's behind the ramus of the mandible and on the medial sides of the ramus. you'll feel grape-like clusters of cells, and they secrete into tubes leading into the oral cavity. They produce serous secretions. This is our parotid. Serous secretions. It's a thin, watery secretion. It is the largest salivary gland, but only produces 25% of the saliva. The duct travels from the gland anteriorly and across the masseter muscle into the buccinator muscle. It opens into the oral cavity opposite the second molar, the maxillary second molar. So what tooth numbers would that be?
Is it 1 and 16?
So those would be the third molars. You're close, thank you.
2 and 15.
2 and 15, okay? So opposite the maxillary second molars. So we know that saliva, when it cools and calcifies, it causes calculus. So where do you think we're gonna find calculus on the maxillary, most commonly on the maxillary teeth? We're gonna find it around the second molars. Is this starting to make sense a little bit, why it's important? Okay. Now our submandibular gland, this is our mixed gland. While the sublingual is mixed, it's not mixed as much. So we're going to talk about the submandibular as the mixed gland. So what does that mean? Is that it produces both serous and mucus cells. The mucus secretion, again, is going to be more viscous than serous. So viscous meaning thicker. It is located below and toward the posterior part of the mandible, and it wraps around the mylohyoid muscle in the neck. The duct extends from the deep part of the gland and opens into the sublingual caruncle at the base of the lingual freedom. So if you go to the mirror and you lift your tongue to the roof of your mouth, you're going to see these two little knobs that are sticking out on the side of your lingual freedom, and that is the that is the duct in which this gland drains. Okay. All right, let's go to our sublingual. That is our smallest gland and the gland that produces the least amount of secretions. The secretions are more viscous than the submandibular, located in the floor of the mouth next to the mandibular canines. One major duct opens with the submandibular duct, and then several small minor ones. So on that sublingual caruncle, it's also draining the sublingual. But then you have kind of this loose tissue next to it, and there's several ducts on that also that are draining the sublingual gland. It is surrounded by minor sublingual glands, okay? All right, minor salivary glands. These are the ones that we have all over our labial, buccal mucosa, our palate, floor of our mouth. Similar structure to the major glands, but they're much smaller and less branching. They're more superficial. The primary difference is the size, number, and number of ducts. The function of the minor salivary gland is to secrete minor amounts of saliva onto the surface to keep the mucosa moist. Okay. Some are pure serous, but most are going to be mucus. And then some are mixed, but that's like the least amount. They have very short ducts. They may cluster, many clusters, each with its own duct. And then it is located on the labial mucosa, the buccal mucosa, the palate, the palatoglossal area, and lingually. Minor salivary glands, labial and buccal glands. The labial glands are located in the upper and lower lips, labial meaning lips, right? Opening into their inner surface. These are mixed glands, but mostly mucus, just like our sublingual, right? They're have a lot in common with the sublingual. The buccal glands are located on the inner cheek region and similar to the labial glands, differing only in location. So we have labial and then buccal. So of course they're going to be pretty similar, right? All right, palatine and palatoglossal glands located in the soft palate and in the posterior and lateral portions of the hard palate. These are also mucus glands, referred to as the glossopalatine glands. They're located at the anterior fold of the tissue in front of the palatine tonsil. Where are our palatine tonsils? Those are the ones that we're checking when we go get a strep test done. Okay? All right, I'm gonna have somebody else read this slide because I need my coffee here. So Heidi, you want to read this for us, the anterior lingual glands?
Sure, my service isn't great, so it might be kind of choppy.
Okay, thank you for letting us know.
Okay, so the anterior lingual glands are found near the tip of the tongue, open onto the ventral surface, and mostly mucus.
Okay, so everybody, here's the tip of your tongue. Then open onto the ventral, so underneath the tip of your tongue. These are mostly mucus, okay? Summer, can I have you read the next one? The oh so important glands of von Ebner.
Lingual glands, von Ebner. Serous glands located beneath vagal papilla, open into, through, around the gland, wash off taste buds so that they can perceive new taste.
Very good. Okay, so the lingual glands of von Ebner, located beneath the valley papilla. They're in that trough, right? And they're secreting saliva, mucus, saliva, and just kind of not mucus, serous saliva, and it's just washing the taste bud, washing the tongue. All right, Kate, can you go ahead and read the first one here?
Posterior lingual glands located around the lingual tonsils and pure mucosa glands.
Okay, so pure mucus glands, these are located on the lingual tonsils or around the lingual tonsils. Sublingual glands, let's see here, who haven't I picked on? Zoe, go ahead and read the sublingual glands.
One second, I gotta move my thing. All right, so sublingual glands, small individual glands that surround the major sublingual gland, open into a row of ducts along sublingual fold in the floor of the mouth, and mucus glands.
Okay, so these are mucus. Let's see here. Haley, why don't you go ahead and read the first three here? So this is in general our salivary glands.
Controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system controls the blood flow, important in saliva production. Stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system decreases the flow of blood to the glands and slows the production of saliva.
Okay, great. Chelsea, go ahead and read our last three.
The smell of food or the presence of something in the mouth will start the glands secreting saliva. Normal amounts of saliva production vary greatly, and nerve supply, primarily the 7th cranial nerve.
Okay, and we're going to learn a lot about the 7th cranial nerve because that is our nerves of facial expression. So it's kind of interesting to me. All right, Journey, why don't you go ahead and read the first, actually read all three of them.
Ducts start as a dimple at the point of origin, develops a cluster of small balls, form a solid cord of cells until glandular cells begin to develop. Solid cord breaks down in the middle, forming a duct.
Okay. All right, what do you guys think of salivary glands? Pretty important, huh? All right, let me pull out this video.
Hi everyone.
Hey everyone. All right.
It's Nicole from KenHub, and today we're going to be talking about the main salivary glands. And in this tutorial, we're going to be looking at this image of the right lateral view of the head with the skin cut away. And over here, of course, we have the tongue highlighted in blue. Before we go on to talk about the different salivary glands, let's first define a salivary gland. And a salivary gland is a secretory gland that secretes tasteless clear saliva. The saliva has many important functions, such as keeping the mucous membrane in the mouth moist, lubrication of food, prevention of tooth decay, and of course the salivary glands are also where the digestion of food starts. So now that we know what the salivary glands are, let's talk a little bit about their divisions. And the salivary glands in our body can be divided into the major and the minor glands. But in this video, we're going to be talking about the major salivary glands, which are the sublingual, submandibular, and the parotid glands. And as we talk about these, we'll talk through the borders, the pathway of the ducts, the blood supply, and the innervation of these glands. So let's begin by talking about the borders of the major salivary glands. And there are several borders of the major salivary glands, the first being the floor of the mouth, which is this collection of muscles just here in the blue triangle, the inferior surface of the tongue, which is where the salivary glands will open into. So now that we've defined both of those, let's begin by looking at the floor of the mouth and what's located in this region. So the floor of the mouth is mainly formed by the mylohyoid muscle, the geniohyoid muscle, which is not illustrated in our main image of the lateral base exposed, but you can see it here on the skeleton and the mandible. And coming back to this image, you can see that we've dotted the geniohyoid out in blue. The floor of the mouth also has the digastric muscle and the stylohyoid muscle. And it's in this region where you'll find the sublingual and the submandibular glands and their related structures. But first, let's go through some of the muscles we just mentioned, starting with the mylohyoid muscle, which is highlighted in green in this image. And as you can see, the mylohyoid muscle makes up the majority of the floor of the mouth and supports the salivary glands. The geniohyoid muscle, seen here in our image of the mandible and the hyoid bone, depresses the mandible and helps open the mouth. And it also pulls the hyoid forward and up during swallowing. And you can see the hyoid bone highlighted in blue on our right. The long, thin muscle that you can see below the mylohyoid muscle, highlighted in green in our image, is the digastric muscle. The digastric muscle is made up of two bellies, an interior belly and a posterior belly. And as you can see on the image, the two bellies are interconnected by a tendon that is held at the level of the hyoid bone, and this tendon is known as the connective tendon. Now the muscle that you can see surrounding the posterior belly of the digastric muscle is the stylohyoid muscle, and the stylohyoid muscle also makes up the floor of the mouth and inserts into the hyoid bone.
Let's now have a look at the inferior surface of the tongue, where the salivary gland ducts will open into, and the inferior surface of the tongue rests on the floor of the mouth. As you can see on our image on the right, you can see the tongue, which I'm pointing at with my blue arrow, and the tongue is lifted so we can see the lower surface and the structures beneath it. The first one is the frenulum of the tongue, which is highlighted in green, and that's a mucosal fold that extends to the gingiva, or the gums, that is seen at the midline on the lower surface of the tongue when you lift it up. On the floor of the oral cavity, the mucosa contains a long, narrow mucosal fold on either side, known as the sublingual fold, and this fold covers the sublingual gland, which we'll talk a little bit more about a bit later. And near where the frenulum of the tongue starts, on the floor of the oral cavity, there's a small bump known as the sublingual caruncle, where the ducts of the large sublingual gland and the submandibular gland open together or near each other. So now we've gone through the basic anatomy of the oral cavity and looked at its borders, we can start looking at the different salivary glands, starting with the sublingual gland. And as you can see, the sublingual gland is an almond-shaped gland, and it's also the smallest gland out of the major salivary glands. It has several ductal openings that run along the sublingual folds and also secretes the smallest portion of saliva every day. The sublingual glands also lie bilaterally on the floor of the mouth, and as we mentioned before, the floor of the mouth is formed by the mylohyoid, the geniohyoid, the digastric and the stylohyoid muscles, and let's just briefly go over them again. So here we have the mylohyoid muscle, the geniohyoid muscle now dotted out in blue, the digastric muscle is just here, and our stylohyoid is down here. The sublingual gland is bordered by the mandible anteriorly, which you can see highlighted in blue, and by the genioglossus muscle postero-inferiorly, and you can see that highlighted in blue on the image on our right. And the tongue covers the gland superiorly, and both the sublingual glands unite to form a horseshoe shape under the frenulum of the tongue, which is seen in the midline under the tongue. Let's talk a little bit now about the pathway of the sublingual duct, and the sublingual gland has many small ducts such as ducts of Rivinus and the duct of Bartholin that open along the margin of the sublingual folds. But what's important to know in this slide is that the duct of the major sublingual gland complex opens to the sublingual caruncle, which you can see highlighted in blue, which is the small elevated bump which we saw before, and the numerous minor sublingual glands give short ducts that open along the sublingual fold, and you can see these dotted out in blue as well. As for the arterial blood supply of the sublingual gland, there are two separate arteries that supply it. And on the image, you can see the external carotid artery, which branches into the lingual artery. And on this image, you can see the lingual artery giving off a branch called the sublingual artery, which you can see here in the image, traveling towards the sublingual gland. And you'll note that the artery is a little bit small in this image, so we're just going to zoom in a little bit, and you can see the sublingual artery just here. And the second artery that supplies the sublingual gland is the submental artery, which is a branch of the facial artery. As for the venous drainage, the veins responsible for draining the sublingual gland are the veins with corresponding names of those with the arteries, so the sublingual vein and the submental vein, which drain into the lingual and facial veins. And in this image, we've highlighted the facial vein, which, as you can see, drains into the common facial vein, which itself drains into the internal jugular vein. And the arteries that are lying just anterior to the internal jugular vein is the carotid artery. Moving on to the sublingual gland's innervation. The innervation of the sublingual gland is carried out by the chorda tympani nerve, which contains fibers originating from the facial nerve, which is cranial nerve 7. And this nerve is important to know as it contains secretomotor fibers, which are responsible for the nerve stimulus of saliva secretion. Also, the chorda tympani joins the lingual branch of the mandibular nerve and carries taste sensation from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and parasympathetic ganglionic fibers to the submandibular ganglion for the innervation of the submandibular and the sublingual salivary glands. And the sympathetic fibers travel to it via the plexus along the lingual artery, but don't worry if you didn't catch that, we'll go through that again. Let's zoom in a little bit. And as you can see, we have our chorda tympani, and as we said before, the chorda tympani joins with the lingual nerve, which is a branch of the mandibular nerve, to carry taste fibers from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, and also the secretomotor fibers, which you can see down here, which carry innervation to the submandibular ganglion. And if you didn't get that pathway just then, we're going to go over it again one more time a little bit later in the tutorial, so don't despair. Let's move on now to the submandibular gland, and as you can see, the submandibular glands are located both superiorly and inferiorly to the inner aspect of the mandible in the submandibular triangle of the neck. And the submandibular triangle of the neck is sometimes called the digastric triangle. Let's talk through the borders of this submandibular triangle. and it is bordered superiorly by the inferior border of the mandible and the mastoid process of the skull, which I've drawn for you as this upside down triangle just here on the right. It's bordered posteriorly by the posterior belly of the digastric muscle, seen here in the image, as well as the stylohyoid muscle, which you can now see highlighted in blue. Anteriorly, it's bordered by the anterior belly of the digastric muscle, which you can see just here. And the floor of the submandibular triangle is made up of the mylohyoid muscle, this muscle that you can see on the image, which is cut. Let's talk now about the submandibular duct, which is also known as Wharton's duct. And the submandibular duct is around about 5 centimeters long and arises between the mylohyoid and the hyoglossus muscle. And so I've pointed out the mylohyoid again for you in blue. And the hyoglossus muscle is not in this image, but I've dotted it out for you in blue. The duct then travels along the superior surface of the mylohyoid muscle, seen here in the illustration, and then passes forward medial to the sublingual gland to open on the sublingual caruncle, and the sublingual caruncle is situated on each side of the base of the lingual frenulum. Let's now briefly talk about the arteries responsible for supplying the submandibular gland with arterial blood. And the submandibular gland has the same arterial blood supply as the sublingual gland. So if you remember from previous slides, the sublingual gland was supplied by the submental artery and the sublingual artery. And so, of course, you can see them again in our image. And as we mentioned before, these two arteries are branches of the lingual artery, which arises from the external carotid and the facial arteries. Similarly, the submandibular gland is mainly drained by the submental vein, which anastomoses with the sublingual vein, and the facial vein joins the submental and the sublingual veins, which together drain into the internal jugular vein. So as we mentioned before, the innervation of the submandibular and sublingual glands are the same, and if you remember from our previous slides, both are innervated by secretomotor fibers of the facial nerve, which is cranial nerve 7. The parasympathetic innervation from the chorda tympani nerve from the facial nerve joins the lingual nerve in the same pathway. We're going to go through this pathway one more time just for your benefit. So we have the chorda tympani, and we have the lingual nerve. We have our secretomotor fibers coming off the lingual nerve just as before, and of course we have the submandibular ganglion. But in this image I just wanted to draw in fibers from the submandibular ganglion to innervate the submandibular gland, and here are some fibers innervating the sublingual gland. The sympathetic innervation from the superior cervical ganglion accompanies the lingual artery to the submandibular tissue. I'm just going to explain this a little bit more because it's not entirely clear in this image. So the superior cervical ganglion is located down below this image, somewhere around C2 and C3, and it gives off fibers that run along with the lingual artery of the submandibular gland and the ganglion. Now that we've finished talking about the submandibular and sublingual glands, let's move on now to the parotid gland. And the parotid gland, as you can see, is the largest of the major salivary glands. It's located in the front of the ear, the preauricular region. And of course the parotid gland has borders, and these are, so the anterior border is the masseter muscle, which is one of the muscles of mastication, and you can see here highlighted in blue. It's also anteriorly bordered by the mandibular ramus, which you can't see in this image, but I've dotted out for you in blue. It's superiorly bordered by the zygomatic arch, which again you can't see, but I've dotted it out for you. While posteriorly, the parotid is bordered by the mastoid process of the skull and the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which is this big muscle you can see clearly here on the right of the neck. You can also feel this muscle when you turn your head from side to side. So the parotid gland has an irregular shaped parotid bed or nest, which can otherwise be described as the structures surrounding and touching the parotid gland. And these structures are mostly found behind the ramus of the mandible and in front of the styloid process, and we're going to go through its borders as well. So the parotid bed is bordered anteriorly by the masseter muscle, the ramus of the mandible, and the medial pterygoid muscle. Posteriorly, it's bordered by the sternocleidomastoid, as well as the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. Medially, the parotid nest is bordered by the stylohyoid muscle, which of course runs from the styloid process of the hyoid, the stylopharyngeus muscle, which runs from the styloid process to the thyroid cartilage and the pharyngeal wall, as well as the styloglossus muscle, which runs from the styloid process of the hyoglossus muscle and the mandible, and draws the tongue backwards. It's also bordered by the external carotid artery, which divides into the superficial temporal artery that travels on the temporal muscle and the maxillary artery. And superiorly, the parotid bed is bordered by the zygomatic arch. So we wanted to talk about the parotid nest because the parotid nest has quite a few important structures. And these structures include the parotidomasseteric fascia, the divisions of the facial nerve, which you can see here in the image, and exits the parotid nest, the auriculotemporal nerve from cranial nerve V3, found near the acoustic meatus. We also have the parotid lymph node, the retromandibular vein, which has two divisions, a posterior division seen here and an anterior division seen here, as well as the external carotid artery, also seen here on the image. As we mentioned before, the facial nerve is one of the contents of the parotid nest and is in close contact with the parotid gland. Now, the facial nerve runs through the parotid gland and comes out with 5 separate branches, as seen on this picture. And this group of nerves is also called the parotid plexus, from which the branches of the facial muscles arise. And we're going to go through these branches right now, beginning with the temporal branches, which innervate the muscles of facial expression above the eye, and are roughly in the area of the blue circle. The zygomatic branches, which cross the upper cheek and supply the orbicularis oculi muscle, which is the muscle that encircles the eye. The buccal branches that innervate the muscles responsible for facial expression below the orbit and above the chin. The marginal mandibular branches, which are responsible for innervating the risorius muscle, which is the muscle involved with smiling, and the muscles of the lower lip and chin, as well as the cervical branch, which is the most inferior branch, and it descends and innervates the platysma of the neck, which you can see in the image on our right. And to help you remember all the different branches of the facial nerve, we have this nifty little image to show you. So a way to remember the order and the location of the nerves is to place an open hand on the side of the face, and where your fingers fall, the temporal branch is going to be where your 5th finger is, your 4th finger is going to be in the zygomatic area, the 3rd finger is going to be in the buccal area, your 2nd finger, which will be on the chin area, will be the marginal mandibular branch, and the 1st finger, which is your thumb, is where the cervical branch runs. A couple more things I want to talk about in this area. The parotid gland is enclosed by a tough fascial capsule called the parotid fascia, and that's part of the parotidomesenteric fascia surrounding the parotid gland and the masseter muscle. And this sheath is part of the deep cervical fascia, which splits into the superficial and deep layers to enclose the parotid gland and lies in front of the external acoustic meatus on the posterior part of the masseter muscle and covers the temporomandibular joint. One more structure I want to look at in this region is the parotid duct, and you can see it highlighted in green on our image on the right. Now, the parotid duct, which is also called the parotid duct of Stenson, is an important structure because it serves as the path that saliva takes from the parotid gland to the mouth. And as you can see, it passes horizontally across the masseter muscle and pierces the buccinator muscle, and you can see both of those highlighted in blue, to open up behind the 2nd maxillary molar into the oral cavity. And the artery that you can see here above the parotid duct is the transverse facial artery, which is a branch of the superficial temporal artery, also seen here, that runs across the face. Of course, we want to talk about the supply of the parotid gland, and the blood supply to the parotid gland comes from the branches of the external carotid artery, which, if you remember, is this artery down here, which are the superficial temporal, the maxillary, and transverse facial arteries. The superficial temporal artery, which you can see here on the image, runs superiorly from the superior portion of the parotid gland to the tip. The maxillary artery exits at the medial portion of the parotid and supplies the infratemporal fossa and the pterygopalatine fossa, and the transverse facial artery branches off from the superficial temporal artery and runs up superior to the parotid duct, as you can see on the image. And the transverse facial artery supplies the parotid gland, the parotid duct, and the masseter muscle. Let's of course have a look at the venous drainage of the parotid gland. And the parotid gland is drained mainly by the retromandibular vein, which is formed by the maxillary vein and the superficial vein that come together. And the retromandibular vein we've covered before, but I'll go through it one more time. So as you can see, the retromandibular vein bifurcates into anterior and posterior branches of the retromandibular vein. The parotid gland is a little bit different to the other 2 glands in that it's innervated by different sources. So let's talk through this. The sensory innervation is provided by the auriculotemporal nerve from the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve, or cranial nerve 5. The parasympathetic innervation, which stimulates the saliva production, is carried from the glossopharyngeal nerve, which gives off the lesser petrosal nerve to synapse in the otic ganglion, and you can see that pathway here highlighted. The parotid gland also receives sympathetic innervation from direct fibers of the external carotid plexus, and you can see that scribbled out down here. So now that we've gone through all the major salivary glands, I want to go through some clinical notes. And the major syndrome I want to talk about is related to the parotid gland, and that's known as Frey syndrome. And Frey syndrome is also known as the auriculotemporal syndrome. And Frey syndrome is a rare neurological disorder that results from damage to or near the parotid glands, or from damage to the auriculotemporal nerve, commonly from a surgery. So if that happens, the patient will not be able to control sweating that occurs behind the cheek, the ears, and the temporal region after eating certain foods that produce a strong salivary response. A lot rarer are tumours in the parotid gland, but they can also develop, although 80% of them are usually found to be benign. One more thing is a viral infection called mumps, and this mostly affects children and is clinically presented with typical swelling of the parotid glands, fever, and vomiting. With the submandibular glands, there's a condition where a calcified mass forms, and this is called sialolithiasis. Sialolithiasis is the most common disorder of the salivary glands. It usually presents as swelling and pain in the cheek when eating, and treatment usually involves moist heat and NSAID use, but it can also be aided by sucking on something sour like a lemon, which can sometimes help pass the stone. But if the stone persists, surgery is usually required. Of course, now that we've finished the tutorial, I want to go over what we talked about today. And of course, we talked about the major salivary glands, the sublingual, which is the smallest of the glands, the submandibular gland, and the parotid gland, which is the largest of the major salivary glands. We also talked about the borders of the oral cavity, which included the floor of the mouth, which holds the mylohyoid muscle, the geniohyoid muscle, which you can see dotted in blue on our right here, the digastric muscle, which has an anterior and posterior belly, and the stylohyoid muscle, which surrounds the digastric muscle. The other border of the oral cavity and of the salivary glands is the inferior aspect of the tongue, which includes the frenulum of the tongue, which you can see when you lift up the tongue, the sublingual fold, which is where ducts from the sublingual gland empty into, as well as the sublingual caruncle, which you can see highlighted in green. And of course, we went through the sublingual gland, which in terms of its borders include the mandible, the genioglossus muscle, and the tongue. And in terms of its duct, the major pathway is through the sublingual caruncle, whereas its minor pathway includes the sublingual fold. Again, you can see the little ducts opening up there. The sublingual gland is supplied by the sublingual artery and the submental artery. And its venous drainage is similarly drained by the sublingual vein and the submental vein. And we talked about how the sublingual gland is innervated by the chorda tympani. For the submandibular gland, we talked about its location, which is in the submandibular triangle, and how the pathway of its duct, which you can see highlighted in green, runs towards the sublingual gland. And of course, the arterial supply and the venous drainage and the innervation of the submandibular gland is the same as the sublingual gland. For the parotid gland, we talked about the borders, which include the masseter muscle, the mandibular ramus, the zygomatic arch, the mastoid process, and the sternocleidomastoid muscle. And in terms of its duct, we talked about how it traversed across the masseter muscle and the buccinator muscle to open out behind the second maxillary molar. Its arterial supply included the superficial temporal artery, the maxillary artery, and the transverse facial artery, which runs superior to the parotid gland. And the venous drainage includes the retromandibular vein, which has an anterior and posterior part. The parotid gland is innervated by the auriculotemporal nerve and the glossopharyngeal nerve, as well as the direct fibers of the external carotid plexus. We also talked about the parotid nest, whose borders include the masseter, the ramus of the mandible, the medial pterygoid muscle, the sternocleidomastoid muscle, the posterior belly of the digastric muscle, the stylohyoid, the stylopharyngeus, the styloglossus muscle, the external carotid artery, and the zygomatic arch. We also talked about the contents of the parotid nest, which include the parotidomasseteric fascia, the facial nerve, the auriculotemporal nerve, the parotid lymph node, the retromandibular vein, and the external carotid artery. In our clinical notes, we talked about the conditions of the parotid gland, which included Frey syndrome, which, as you remember, arises from damage to the auriculotemporal nerve. We talked about tumours, 80% of which are mostly benign, and mumps, which is a viral infection more common in children. We also talked about a condition of the submandibular gland, which is probably the most common condition out of all of the conditions, and that is sialolithiasis, which is when a calcified mass forms within the submandibular duct, causing pain and swelling in the cheek. And that's all we have time for today. Thanks for watching.
Okay. All right. I hope you guys found that helpful. It's a lot of information. Let me unshare this here. There we go. Okay. Hopefully you guys found that helpful So when you're doing your intra and extra oral exams, you know, you want to palpate this. And how do you think you would do that? When you have to kind of make this stick out, so first you're going to feel it, check for any firmness, and then you're going to have your patient kind of clench and see if those muscles are working there, and also if that parotid gland sticks out. For the submandibular, you're going to go inside with your finger and push up here, push down with your finger, and you're going to feel, and that submandibular is way back here. All right. And then as you move forward, you're going to feel more of the sublingual gland here. One thing that you guys may see is a ranula, and that is when the saliasis, she says it so much better than I do, occurs, and that's when there is a stone plugging that salivary duct. Okay. Has anybody here ever had a salivary stone? Yes, Esther. Okay. Yeah, they're not fun. So if your patient has one, the dentist may recommend that they suck on a lemon. That'll really try and push it out. If that doesn't work, then sometimes they need to be surgically removed. So those are a couple conditions that you need to know about. Okay. All right, so let's wrap it up here with a quick review. Let me pull up my form that I had here.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Is that disease the only one? Because I remember there was one that prevents salivation and tears. I don't remember what it was called.
That is called, I keep wanting to say Rye syndrome, Sjogren's syndrome.
Yeah.
Yep, where you'll have dry mouth and everything, but that's not a condition of only the salivary glands. So that's why it's not talked about here, but we'll be talking about that in pharmacology. Okay. All right, you guys, quick review here. I wrote down some questions earlier and some others. Let me pull up both of those. Okay, let's start with these. Okay, what happens if you contract your longitudinal muscles in your tongue?
Shortens the tongue.
It shortens the tongue. Thank you. Okay. Somebody describe what hairy tongue is to me.
Long papillas that food and bacteria get trapped in it.
Yes, so they are not pretty. They are elongated papilla. Let's see here. Then let's see here. Oh, when does the tongue begin to develop, and what pharyngeal arch does the anterior 2/3 develop from?
4.5 weeks.
4.5 weeks. So everybody write that down. Okay. And then which arch?
First arch.
The first, the mandibular. Okay. And it just erupts through that pharyngeal arch and develops that anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Okay, let's see here. Oh, okay, so now we're going to our salivary glands, and what gives the squid-like appearance of the myoepithelial cells?
I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but is it the acini?
The acini? Mm-hmm. Okay, so it is the cellular projections of the myoepithelium. Okay, that surround the acini. Okay, so cellular projections, it's the myoepithelial cells that surround the acini. What's that?
Oh, nothing.
Okay. All right. What glands are responsible for rinsing and cleansing the tongue, or the taste buds, I should say?
The von Ebners.
The von Ebners. Very good. And where are those found?
They're at the base of the circumvallate
Right.
papillae.
They're in that trough of the circumvallate. And where are the circumvallate found?
About 2/3 of the way back.
Right. So it separates the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and the posterior 2/3 of the tongue. Very good. Let me see here. Oh, one thing that wasn't on, I didn't find in the book, I don't recall it being in the video, but I want you guys to know the different names of the ducts that are found in the oral cavity. So the buccal, or the ones found on the buccal mucosa from the parotid glands, is the Stenson's duct. Now, more commonly now they're calling it the parotid duct, but I want you guys to know kind of the history also in case that's on your boards. So either Stenson's or parotid duct. And then the submandibular is the Wharton's duct, WHARTON''S.
For the Wharton's duct, that one, I was just a tip. I was able to remember because whales go underneath the water. So
Oh, there you go. So under the tongue, yep. And Stenson's, I always think it's on top, so it's like a little cowboy hat. Stetson cowboy hat. I don't know. I grew up on a farm. What can I say? All right. And then the sublingual is the Bartholomew's, the duct, Bartholomew's duct. All right. So I'm not sure what your boards will call them. Like I said, it isn't in the book, so I'm hoping that they wouldn't use those. But just in case, I wanted to make sure that I added that for you guys.
Would the sublingual caruncle not be a correct answer?
No, that's the structure that they're located on.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Let's see here. What is the structure I told you guys about when you get a plugged salivary gland, minor salivary gland?
Mucosia.
Mucocele. And what if it's a major salivary gland? Then what do we call it? Just briefly mentioned that a little bit ago.
Is that the stone that you were saying that I have?
Yep, and then it plugs that gland, and then it develops into instead of a mucocele, it's called a ranula, R-A-N-U-L-A. And it's just where it swells, and you can see. In fact, I'm on a couple dental hygiene things on Facebook, and somebody was just starting to develop one. It looked like a little fisheye there. It was a small one, but sometimes it can get.
Sorry?
What's that?
What's it called again? Sorry.
A ranula, R-A-N. It might be two N's. R-A-N-N-U-L-A. Ranula. Let me look it up. All of a sudden, now no, R-A-N-U-L-A. Oh, I was right the first time. Go with my instinct. All right, and what structures are going to help us fight infection?
The lymphatic tissue of the tonsils.
Very good. And then what in saliva is going to help us fight infection? You guys remember? Yep, lysosomes. Mhm. Okay. Oh, this is briefly mentioned in your book. Okay, can the tongue be an indicator of health? Systemic health?
Yes.
Yeah, just like the gingiva, right? Very much it can be an indicator of health. And then what do minor salivary glands secrete?
Water, saliva.
What kind of saliva? Mucus or serous or mixed? Primarily.
Mucus.
Mucus. Think of it as like it needs to stick to the mucosa of the oral cavity to keep it lubricated. What does the parotid gland mainly secrete?
Serous.
Very good. And then what does the submandibular secrete? What kind of saliva is coming through that Wharton's duct?
Sterile mucus.
Sterile mucus, so a combination, right? And then what about the sublingual?
Mainly mucus.
Mainly mucus. Okay, not all mucus, but mainly mucus. All right.
I noticed while we were going through the book and through the lecture PowerPoint today, some points would say mucus, some would say pure mucus, and then I know we talked about mostly mucus. How will we specify those, like on exams?
It would say mainly mucus. You know, if it says all mucus, what would be the answer?
Are mucus and pure mucus the same then in that case?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
So mucus, there's none that secrete only mucus. Okay. There's some that secrete mainly mucus, which is our sublingual, right? But nothing is only mucus, only, okay? Let's see here. I think we've covered all of the things I wanted to cover here. Let me just double check. What does transverse mean again?
Across.
Across, very good. When does the tongue begin to develop?
4.5 weeks.
4.5 weeks, and after the buccopharyngeal membrane ruptures, that first arch in the buccopharyngeal membrane is going to erupt, and the tongue is going to come through that. All right. When does striation, when will we see striated salivary ducts? Or cells, I should say. Are they in intralobular or interlobular? Or both?
Both.
They are in both. Okay, very good. So remember, they're much more common in the intralobular, but they do occur in both. Okay. All right, I think that about covers everything. So again, tonight your worksheets are due by 11:59, and you have a quiz next week. I will count the questions. Let me just change my screen here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 15 are true and false. Okay. All right. Do you guys have any further questions? Feel like you have a pretty good handle on it? Seems like you guys have a good handle on it.
Can you repeat the answer for what structures will help fight infection?
Okay, so Samantha, you helped with that one. Can you go ahead and help her with that? Structures that help and fight infection.
The lymphatic tissue of the tonsils.
Yep, and then saliva also helps fight infection. Okay, any other questions? Okay, will anybody be attending?
Sorry, I didn't hear the structure, sorry.
It's the lymphatic tissue, such as the tonsils. Okay, any other questions? Does anybody have questions for remediation? Will you be attending remediation? Okay, Chelsea, you do? Okay.
Just a quick question though, or just something.
Do you want to ask it in here, or do you want to wait?
Yeah.
For...
Yeah,
Okay.
I just sent you a message in Canvas, so if you can just check your Canvas messages.
Okay. All right, anybody else have a question about anything? Okay. Oh, posting the rest of the PowerPoints. I don't have them at home with me. They're on an external hard drive at the school. I can post those. I may be modifying them a little bit, but Chelsea has requested that I post the rest of the PowerPoints, and I'm happy to do that when I get into the office today, yes, for the rest of the semester. Woo! You guys, we just wrapped up week 10 of 16. That's awesome. You guys are doing great. All right. Any other questions? None?
Are we allowed to work ahead too?
Yes. Yep. People have been working ahead. You know, the grades get released at the same time. So you won't see your grades, but yeah, absolutely. You're welcome to work ahead. A lot of people have. And then, you know, to start studying for your final, you know, go back and review some of those worksheets. Okay. I know some of you guys have appointments with me to review tests. That's always a good idea too. I only review the questions you got wrong. Okay. Any other questions? All right. I'm going to let you guys go. Thank you guys for coming on a early, hard Monday morning after all this heat. So I appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you guys again next week. I really look forward to seeing you guys on campus. I so hope we're there this fall. So, all right, take care, you guys. Bye.